All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Mid Morning. It is that time of year where illnesses are always going around, and we are trying to protect our kids as much as possible, especially when they go off to school. And Dr. Keith Watson joining me at the table this morning. And I told you I kind of came up with this topic based on some personal experience.
Sure.
Kids' yearly checkups. What are some good questions that parents should ask, or some things they should be prepared to listen to from their child's doctor during those yearly checkups?
It's a good question. I will, an easy answer is to say any question that a parent's got, that's the time to ask it. And I hear a lot from my parents, they'll go, I have a stupid question. And of course, the response is always, there's no stupid questions if you're concerned about your child. So any question, any concern you've got, the checkup is the time to do it. Growth, development, social interactions with kids, how much sleep to get, how much time to be on the computer, anything you've got's a good thing. Questions to be prepared to answer. Typically at checkups, the pediatrician is going to have questions about development.
Okay.
For example, if I go to the doctor now and I go to the doctor next year, I'm pretty much the same, other than maybe a few more pounds under my belt that my doctor doesn't like. But with children, and especially younger children and infants, a 6-month-old and 9-month-old are different. And any parent that's got kids knows, a 6-month-old might be sitting up, but you can put them in the floor and they pretty much stay where they're at. But the 9-month-old crawls and that type of thing. So a doctor is going to ask, especially depending upon the age of the child, how they're doing with their development. Are they meeting certain milestones? And if they're not, that might raise a concern for the physician. They're going to ask about speech. Are they saying words that are clear? Those types of things. Are they interacting socially, especially 2, 3, and 4-year-olds? Do they interact with peers appropriately? Do they play? Do they engage other children? Because if you have a child that doesn't engage other children, the doctor might be worried about something like autism or those types of things. So you're going to get a lot of questions from the pediatrician about, does your child do this? Fill in the blank based on the age of the child.
And that kind of leads me to exactly my next question. So as a child gets older, the questions that parents have or concerns that they might have at 9 months versus 9 years and
Correct.
15 years old.
Correct.
I mean, are all completely different. I guess, what are some things, let's talk about maybe the teenagers.
Okay.
What are some things maybe there that parents should be thinking about asking a pediatrician?
Alcohol.
Did not think of that.
Vaping, cigarettes, chewing tobacco, driving safety, gun safety. This is the South. People own guns. I own guns. How do we keep our guns safe in the house so that our kids don't get into them or know not to mess with them? Those types of things. Safety is a huge issue once a child becomes mobile. Once a child becomes mobile, so about 9 months, one of the leading causes of injuries and death in children are accidents of all kinds. And so anything involving safety for a child, guns, swimming, safety around swimming pools, those types of things would be things that I would expect parents to either ask me, or I would ask parents, do you have guns in the house? Where do you keep them? How are you sure they're safe? How do you keep them safe? Those types of things.
All good advice. All right, we'll have some more from Dr. Watson after the break. Stay with us. All right, welcome back, everybody. Dr. Keith Watson at the table with us this morning, and we're going to swap gears. We were talking about office visits for your children, but one thing, as we've seen, there have been a lot of food recalls, contamination, different things like that. So it kind of got me to thinking: is there a big difference between how one feels when they have eaten food that may be contaminated, or they have the stomach bug, which is going around.
Right. There are some differences, but symptoms of both overlap.
Okay.
So you can't ever, on the doctor end, be completely certain based upon the story you get from your patient. I mean, you can run tests and determine the cause, but some differences where you might consider one versus the other is foodborne illnesses in many cases will present with fevers.
Okay.
Now again, a stomach virus can, but some of your more severe bacterial type infections, salmonella or E. coli, which can be in improperly cooked food or spoiled food, you can have fevers. In many cases, if there is a lower GI problem, meaning the child's got diarrhea, some of those illnesses tend to have pretty significant bloody diarrhea.
Oh, okay.
Salmonella in particular causes horrible stomach cramping. You know, if you've got the stomach virus, you may be nauseous, but most people with the stomach virus are not in pain. But if you have salmonella poisoning from poorly cooked chicken or something like that, you have vomiting, diarrhea, you typically have fever. We see kids with bloody diarrhea, and they're having horrible abdominal cramping. When you see those symptoms, I think of salmonella, those types of things. So there's no foolproof way other than testing it, but just kind of a rough rule of thumb, bloody stools, abdominal pains, higher fevers, you get the bacteria thought. The other thing you might think too, if it's food and the family ate the whole meal, you likely may have multiple family members sick at the same time.
That would make sense.
Yeah, if you get the stomach virus that passes through the house, one gets it and a couple of days later another one gets it, and there's more of a passage to each person over several days. But if someone were to eat food that was improperly cooked or stored, everybody gets sick very abruptly. So those are indirect. Those are indirect things that may make you think that. It's not, again, not foolproof, but those are a couple of things that might tilt you one way versus the other.
Okay. All right, and before we go, I always like to ask you about this. Trends you're seeing in the office, anything in particular? Still seeing lots of flu, strep type stuff?
Still seeing a lot of flu and strep, and like you said, some stomach bugs going around, but it's still pretty much as we say, the bread and butter winter cold weather type stuff.
All right, thanks so much for joining us,
welcome.
Dr. Watson. Always informative, and I'm glad I can spring questions on you.
You're welcome.
All right, we talked about food contamination. Well, it's becoming more widespread and in many cases severe. A report published by the Public Interest Research Group shows most illnesses in 2024 were linked to just 13 outbreaks. That's despite more than 300 food recalls last year. Researchers say salmonella, listeria, and E. coli were the most common reasons for food recalls. 19 people died from an illness related to contaminated food, double the number from 2023. Meanwhile, the food chief at the Food and Drug Administration resigns. A Health and Human Services official says Jim Jones left because he did not agree with the Trump administration's agenda to make America healthy again. As a food chief, Jones oversaw food safety and nutrition, including policy changes for labeling food as healthy and banning the use of red dye number 3. The acting commissioner of the Social Security Administration resigned over the weekend. Michelle King resigned following a dispute with the Department of Government Efficiency. A new high-tech tool for young heart patients has been approved by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Doctors say this will allow them to save more lives. Stephanie Stahl has more.
It's a little device with a big job.
It does all the work for your heart.
It's called Impella 5.5, the world's smallest heart pump that helps blood circulate. 21-year-old Katrina Penny was born with congenital heart defects and had her first heart transplant when she was a baby.
My entire childhood was completely normal. I played sports, I went to school, I had friends.
But 2 years ago, the transplanted heart stopped working effectively.
I was in complete heart failure.
She needed a second heart transplant, and while on the waiting list, the Impella kept her alive at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia.
I had my Impella for 5 weeks.
It's very useful in a sense that actually is that it can be implantable without opening the chest.
Dr. Katsuhide Maide says the Impella that he put in Katrina has now been approved for younger children.
We are so excited, yeah. This is a really like a, game changer.
Going to save a lot more lives.
Of course.
With the Impella, Katrina survived until her second heart transplant in June of 2023.
It did save my life 100%.
The graduate student knows just how lucky she was to have had 2 heart transplants, one with the help of a groundbreaking little device. Stephanie Stahl, CBS News.
Go in your heart.
Now that she's recovered, Katrina Penny is looking forward to eventually becoming a special education teacher. All right, we'll be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone. Southwest Airlines is cutting 15% of its corporate workforce. That's more than 1,700 people. This is the first mass layoff in the company's history. The cuts are expected to start in April and will include senior leadership. That includes senior executives and some vice presidents. Southwest says it expects the layoffs will save the company around $210 million this year and $300 million next year. The airline CEO Bob Jordan called the layoffs a very difficult and monumental shift. Last June, hedge fund Elliott Investment Management took a $1.9 billion stake in the carrier. Americans are facing an uphill battle when it comes to managing rising debt burdens. In some cases, they haven't been this overextended since the aftermath of the Great Recession. Ivan Rodriguez joins us and breaks down the latest credit conditions for American households and tips for paying off debt.
Americans are struggling to pay off their debt.
Nobody should be surprised that debt is rising.
A new report by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York shows all major loan categories are on the rise, with credit card balances topping $1.2 trillion, up more than 7% from the fourth quarter of last year. Matt Schultz with LendingTree says while some higher levels of household debt were to be expected because of inflation, it doesn't mean it isn't troubling.
We found that about a third of people took on debt over the holidays.
2 categories where Americans are struggling to manage their debt: auto loans and credit cards. The share of households becoming seriously delinquent, meaning missing a payment for 90+ days, are at 14-year highs.
That car payment is often one of the most prioritized when bills come due. And when that one is not being paid, that's probably a sign that other struggles are around as well.
Schultz says there are some steps people can take to get ahead on paying down their debt.
First thing that they should do is create a budget. You can do things like getting a 0% balance transfer credit card or a low-interest personal loan to consolidate some of those loans and bring the interest rates down.
Schultz says another option people don't realize is they can call their credit card issuer and ask for a lower interest rate on their credit card. He says in 2024, 76% of people who asked for a lower rate got one, and the average was about 6.5 percentage points, according to a December LendingTree survey. That's pretty good. All right, we'll be right back. Stay with us. All right, welcome back, everyone. A few years ago, an editor at the New York Times noticed a big disparity in the newspaper's obituaries. They featured mostly men and not many women and people of color. Meg Oliver introduces us to the devoted obituary writer who's making sure we know more about the remarkable people who blazed a trail.
What do you find down here?
This place is absolutely gold for any obit researcher.
Deep below street level in the morgue at the New York Times is where obituary editor Amy Pednani goes digging. From an old-school card catalog to rows of file cabinets, the room is stuffed with more than 170 years of history.
How hard is it to get into the New York Times obituary?
You have to have done something pretty remarkable, invented something everybody uses, changed the way of life for society at large or a group of people.
Since 1851, the Times has published thousands of obituaries, from heads of state and scientists to celebrities and athletes. But during a research project in 2017, Pednani realized many trailblazers, especially women and people of color, were overlooked. People like Sylvia Plath and Ida B. Wells.
I thought, yeah, why is that? So when I approached my team to ask this question, they said, well, obituaries are a rear view look at society at a time when women and people of color weren't invited to the table to make a difference. I just didn't find that answer very satisfying.
In 2018, she launched Overlooked, a series in the obituary section to remember notable women who were left out. She eventually expanded the following year for Black History Month to include people of color. 7 years later, it's still going strong. This month, she is publishing the obituaries for Mariah Stewart, the first Black woman to speak publicly about racial and gender equality in the 1830s, to Annie Easley.
Annie Easley, for instance, is a scientist who worked for NASA.
And Lena Richard.
Lena Richard was the first Black person to host a cooking show.
The first Black woman to host a cooking show in 1949 before she could eat at the lunch counter.
That's correct.
How was she overlooked?
We ask this question all the time.
The overwhelming response from readers compelled her to publish a book featuring 66 more stories of remarkable people, including Diane Patrick's grandfather, Sinclair Clark.
How would you describe your grandfather?
I never knew him, so I can only describe him as a rock star taxidermy tanner.
A rock star taxidermist?
Yes.
Clark's work is on display at museums around the world, including the American Museum of Natural History in New York.
What did it mean to you to see your grandfather's obituary printed?
It meant that I had something that I could now show to some of the institutions that he worked in.
Patrick discovered her paternal grandfather 2 years before he died. Even then, she didn't know that he worked on the iconic Hall of African Mammals in the museum.
His methods became the standard for these dioramas in this museum and other museums.
The gold standard around the world.
Yes.
It seemed to me he might have been kind of quiet about his own achievements. So I just think he didn't get the attention he deserved in his lifetime, which is part of the reason the Times may not have heard of him at the time that he died.
Overlooked trailblazers finally receiving their due recognition.
Meg Oliver, CBS News, New York.
A very unique story there. Well, on to the Midwest, where fewer people in Iowa are turning to newspapers and magazines for their information. But Black-owned publications in the state are generating a lot of interest. Jody Long has more.
Okay, that took me.
Every month, Duana Bradley spends hours tucked away in this makeshift office at her church, focusing on editing and proofreading a magazine she didn't even want to write.
He was like, no, you really should do it. He was like, it's different. I was like, I don't know.
The idea wasn't hers to begin with. It was her dad's, and he knows a thing or two about publishing print.
So at one point, he had the largest kind of publication this side of the Mississippi. And I remember being 8 and 9, going with him in the middle of the night because he had to meet the printing deadline. It's really cool to see.
Now, 10 years and 120 editions later, the pages keep turning. The Des Moines Urban Experience magazine embodies community.
It was made out of just wanting us to have representation, and we've held true to that for the last 10 years.
You might not recognize the faces on the cover.
We don't cover kind of those mainstream stories that you will see hits the news.
That's exactly why they're there.
Every year I ask myself, do I want to keep doing this? And I'm like, this is more important now than ever, because we're living in a time where we're feeling like our voice is being taken away.
Duana's free magazine is amplifying that voice, and it has company on the newsstand.
So for me, this isn't about competition.
So the more that I go around the state, The more I meet people, the more great stories emerge.
Black Iowa News now reaches statewide, all because its founder is all gas, no brakes.
So you were literally getting in your car and driving around the state of Iowa
with my husband and I. Yeah, we've done it now, I don't know, 5 or 6 times. Yeah, it's great.
Dana James says the journey to owning her own newspaper came after working at the state's largest print publication, feeling like perspectives were missing.
I've talked about this a lot, reporters having to be told to include a person of color in their stories because it didn't come naturally.
Now controlling the narrative and delivering her newspaper by hand is more personal.
People were affected. Some people teared up. Some people clutched the paper to them. And so that enthusiasm, I've never lost that. It continues to be critically important, but also just a dream come true.
We've done that many stories.
Both women have dreams of adding more writers, more readers, and more subscribers. A dream not wrapped up in the stats, but in the stories they're choosing to tell. Like a nudge from a loving parent.
This is really kind of like me saying, like, look, your idea worked, and this is where we're at now.
Honoring culture that cannot be erased.
All right, we'll be right back to wrap things up. Thank you so much for joining us this morning on Mid-Morning. Of course, you can keep up with all the latest news happening on WCBI Midday, WCBI.com, and we'll have all the latest news from the area there. We'll see you next time.